Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the April edition of the HSJCC webinars. So today we're going to be looking at gendered pathways to crime, and it is actually April 30th, not March 30th, so just checking to see if everyone's paying attention. For those who are joining us via the teleconference option rather than listening through their speakers, can you please make sure that your lines are muted because we do get some feedback if they're not. So, just wanted to give a quick thank you to CMHA Ontario, and specifically Dorina, and to EENet and Matt for providing their support and hosting this webinar and making it possible to bring it to you. If you'd like to ask questions throughout the webinar, there is a box, and it should appear on the left of your screen that you can ask your questions. We are going to compile them and have the presenters answer at the end of the session rather than as they come. So feel free to ask them either at the end or during the presentation. And we want to let you know, too, that all of the PowerPoint presentations will be emailed out to anybody who's participating in the webinar. They're also going to be posted on the HSJCC website as well. At the end of the presentation, we're going to ask that you take a couple of minutes and just fill out a quick survey about the webinar that helps us plan future webinars. And if you could, too, if you're joining us from a site that has more than one participant, if you could just type the number of participants in the Q&A box so that we get an idea of how many people are actually joining us today, that would be helpful. So we're going to start off with just a little bit of details about the HSJCC. Then we'll move to the Gendered Pathways to Crime presentation, and then have some time at the end for questions and comments. And that's myself, Michael Dunn. I'm the provincial co-chair of the HSJCC. And presenting today is going to be Heather Lumley, who's a member of the HSJCC and the executive director of St. Leonard's Community Services in the London region. So to tell you a little bit about the HSJCC network, for those who don't know, it was established based on the provincial strategy to coordinate human services and criminal justice systems in Ontario in 1997, and really responding to recognized need of two things. The first being the need to coordinate resources and services, and a second, to plan more effectively for people who are in conflict with the law. So priority consideration is really given to those who have mental illness, developmental disabilities, brain injuries, addiction, and FASD. So as you're probably aware, the HSJCC network expands over most regions of the province and has over 1,500 members at the current time. There's 43 local HSJCCs, 14 regionals, and the provincial HSJCC. And each one is really a voluntary collaboration between both those in the health and social service sectors, community health, hospitals, addictions, our justice partners as well, so police, Crown attorneys, judges, and corrections. And we're, of course, funded by our friends at the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. So a little bit about the provincial HSJCC. It consists of the regional HSJCC chairs. So they're representing each of their respective regions, and it's an opportunity for them to bring any local issues that they're seeing at their local or regional tables and help bring them to a provincial table. And it helps very much that we have ex officio members, including correctional services, Ontario Provincial Police. We have a member from the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police, Legal Aid Ontario, and community networks of specialized care. Our ex officio representatives from the 5 ministries include Attorney General, Children and Youth Services, Community and Social Services, Community Safety and Correctional Services, and of course Health and Long-Term Care. So I'll let you know too of some upcoming webinars that you'll likely be interested in. On May 25th, we're going to have a webinar called Bridging the Gap Between Mental Health and Criminal Justice Sectors by Addressing the Social Determinants of Health. And in June, the date's not yet set, we're going to be looking at the Hamilton Rapid Response Team. So you can stay tuned for some more information about those upcoming sessions. And I'll remind you too, that we are going to be having the Provincial HSJCC Conference November 16 to 18 in Toronto, so you'll want to stay tuned for more information about that as well. And there's some contact information if you're looking for more details about the work of the HSJCC or CMHA Ontario or EENet. You can also follow HSJCC on Twitter with the fancy bird thing that I don't really understand, but you can follow them at HSJCC. So just before we get started, I'll remind you, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in as we go along or save them till the end. And at the end of the presentation, Heather will take some time to answer those. If you have any trouble hearing at all, please let us know. We can try to troubleshoot that for you as well. And so that's enough of me talking. I'll turn it over to Heather Lumley, who's going to talk about the gendered pathways to crime.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. Hopeful that everyone can hear me okay. As Mike said, my name is Heather Lumley. I am the Executive Director at St. Leonard's Community Services, London and Region. Today I am going to speak about some research that we did with the University of Western Ontario. To start off, I'll provide a little bit of context about who we are. I know by some of the names in the webinar that some of you know who we are in London, but I'll provide a bit of context around that and why we looked at doing this research. So just to start off with, our agency here in London has 19 different community programs, so we have residential and non-residential. We have funding through 8 different ministries and entities that support the programs that we run here in London. So it's local specific, although we have partnerships and we have international, national, and provincial collaboratives that work together in terms of supporting the programs that we offer here. The one today that I'm going to look in particular at is obviously the one to do with our male and female programs that are residential. The mission at St. Leonard's in London is we are a community agency that's dedicated to promoting positive change. We work with people that are in conflict with the law or that are at risk of being in conflict with the law. We work closely with the police. Obviously, we work with all of the different ministries in terms of promoting a healthier and safer community. The particular house that manages our women residents that are in conflict with the law or at risk is Madame Louise Arbor Center. We have 8 beds. It contains a staffing model that has 24/7 support. We have funding through the federal system as well as the provincial forensic, so we have some not criminally responsible females, and we have mental health funded crisis beds. The primary issues that we see in this house and that we address as the support team is addictions, sex trade, and mental health. The comparative was the male residential facility, which we call Gallagher House, which was established in 1997. Again, it's funded in the exact same way, although there's twice as many beds, and that's primarily due to just funding and the bylaws for London. It's not indicative of the half the need of women in our community. I think that we could always use more support for our female individuals that are in conflict with the law. The primary issues that we work with the men at Gallagher focus in on addictions, mental health, and sexual offending offenses. So back a couple years ago, we started to work with 2 different psychologists at the University of Western Ontario, Dr. Susan Roger and Dr. Alan Leascheid. Both of those individuals have worked over their career with Alan in particular, youth and women involved in criminal justice system, and Susan has focused a lot on women in the criminal justice system. So 2 of their students put together research that we are in the process of publishing and took a look at to increase our understanding of gendered pathways to crime. I'm not going to provide anybody with any real new information, but men are different than women. And in saying that, why do we need to do this research? And much of the research that I'll speak to today will confirm a lot of our hypotheses and what we actually probably know without doing extensive research. But the research assists us in understanding how we can move forward in programming and in supports and interventions for women, increase funding, and work in a more collaborative way to address the needs of the women that we're working with in the criminal justice population. So, sorry, I'm just slipping. This is the basis of the research that we did do. We took a look at 105 different data points. We had a population of 90, so there were 47 females and 43 males. All of the individuals were over the age of 18. The average age for the females was 30, and the average age for the males was 31. The length of stay for the average length of stay for the females was 18 days, and the average length of stay for the males was 21 days. These particular beds that we drew this population from were our beds that were funded through the Ministry of Health. So they typically are 30-day beds, although we do change that or adjust that based on clinical need for the individual. And they have been involved in the criminal justice system in the past 2 years. The population came from the year of 2011-12, and we work with these people inside the houses, and we have external partners that provide support to these individuals as well. When we take a look at the actual population, a lot of them, approximately 75%, are on probation, but they are managed through the mental health beds due to the access to those beds and the time with the courts to get them in. We focus on programming life skills, self-esteem, healthy lifestyles, and healthy boundaries. We do provide support through individual and group format. So this population has experienced all sorts of different interventions, if you will, in a community setting. Again, I know some people have very, very similar operations, so I'm speaking to people that may already know what we do at St. Leonard's. Some of the items that were focused on for the research was the nature of the offense, the psychiatric history of the individuals, the trauma history, as well as the client needs. If we take a look at the gender disparities and why we wanted to look at the differences between men and women, I'm just going to quote the the World Health Organization in 2008, where women lack autonomy, decision-making power, and access to income. Many other aspects of their lives and health will necessarily be outside of their control. In particular, gender-differentiated levels of susceptibility and exposure to the risk of violence place stringent limitations on women's ability to exercise control over the determinants of their mental health. So in saying that, we took a look at these particular factors to better understand what we need to do to increase our successful outcomes. The first study was used to explore the gender effect of past trauma on the pathways to criminal convictions within a sample of community-based offenders. And the second study is looked at 3 different points, how the female offenders' involvement in the criminal justice system differ than males, as well as looking at their substance abuse and mental health needs, as well as the association between offenders with substance abuse and mental health needs and the type of offense that they did commit. When we took a look at the trauma statistics, we did see that there was a difference between men and female. Males, I'm not sure how clear it is out on everybody's computer. Males are the dark bar and females are the light bars. So you can see that there was an increase in emotional and physical abuse for men when they were children, and then the women was a smaller number. If you take a look at the sexual and the maltreatment, that was higher for women than it was for men. So these trauma statistics indicate what types of trauma men and women are experiencing, and then what actual interventions would be the most helpful would be based on those findings. When we take a look at when they're adults, again, males on the dark and females are the light bars. So you can see the most trauma experienced by females in terms of intimate partner violence as well as children removed from care. These two pieces of trauma, again, impact the differing needs of women when they are in a CRF or a residential facility in the community and attempting to reintegrate into the community. When we take a look at the nature of the offense, again, crimes against persons are more prevalent in males and property offenses for females. Why this is important, because we take a look at the risk need. We use risk needs assessment tools. Again, I'm speaking to people in the correctional system, so I don't need to really go over that in great detail. But typically women serve shorter sentences than male. They commit their crimes against people versus violent crimes. And the tool that was used, that has been used over the years in the correctional system is known as the LSI. And it was developed by Andrews and Bonta. And it primarily takes a look at risk, need, and responsivity so that when we do interventions, offenders with higher risk receive greater supervision and a longer duration, and then ones with a lower risk receive minimal or no interventions. So the principle, we take a look at the static factors and then the dynamic factors in terms of providing different types of programming in order to assist individuals in the criminal justice system. So where we take a look at perhaps there's a much greater number of men in the criminal justice system, and a lot of the services and a lot of the tools that were developed back in the day were made for the male population. We're seeing that, and we know that there's a great need to change those up and provide different supports for women. And how do we do that when we take a look at the financial and the fiscal restraints in all of our areas? How can we provide gender-specific programming? But the research is indicating that's exactly what we need to do. When we take a look at the mental health issues, again, this is not new information, but it is definitely indicative of how do we ask for the correct dollars to provide the correct support for the individuals. These slides, again, show that the mental health issues for women is mood, concurrent anxiety, PTSD, and there are some psychotic disorders. Childhood disorders are larger for males, which I think is very interesting and very important. When we take a look at reports such as Risky Business that was put together by Howard Sapers after the death of Ashley Smith, we take a look at the number of incidents of self-harm that has increased inside the institutions. He was looking at the federal system, and the incidents had tripled over the last 5 years. Self-harming behaviors and behaviors that women are exhibiting need to be examined. And I know that the federal system has put together different recommendations, or sorry, the investigator put together different recommendations to the women's sector, and it's about how do we get to implement those recommendations and provide a different level of service for women that are incarcerated. The next slide shows substance use and abuse. And as you'll see, there is a much higher prevalence for alcohol and marijuana for males. And then you take a look at, and I should have combined oxys together with opiates, a much higher use of opiates and crack cocaine in the female house. Why this is important, again, as St. Leonard's provides services, is how do we address those needs? How do we look at the withdrawal from the different substances, because it's much different for, obviously, for alcohol as it is for oxys, and how can we increase the support for those women? Oftentimes, there's a very, very small window of opportunity to actually impact them. So how do we partner with neighboring agencies in order to bring some of that withdraw support within the houses? Oftentimes, I know for our particular service, we aren't necessarily staffed with professionals from the mental health sector or the addiction sector based on our funding models. So how do we develop partnerships that will enhance that type of support for the women within the house? Alan Leascheid commented that this client group often has complex needs that transcends the capacity of individual key workers or single agencies to meet. I think that's very important as we look at collaborations and working together, and such as the HSJCC at a much higher systemic level. How can we move that within our communities? I know in London we've partnered with our addiction provider to be able to address the specific oxy use within our facilities. And how do we make sure that that's something that's a best practice? And obviously greater research is needed to see the outcomes after we've completed some of those programs, but that it's very, very important to understand what the different needs are for women and for men, and how we can increase our services that we're providing for these individuals. This is an interesting slide, I believe. When we take a look at the completion of the program, men are more successful than women. Women withdraw more often. Now, I don't have any formal evidence to back what I'm about to say. It's anecdotal evidence from working with these women. So their length of stay is shorter and they withdraw more often. So we got to think, why is that happening? When we're interviewing the women typically don't have a stable exit plan. They don't have stable housing, and they don't have somewhere to go to. So our question is always, why are they leaving faster? My belief, again, goes back to the trajectory into the criminal justice system, being that they're perhaps working on the street, or they're withdrawing from substances without any support around their actual trauma. So it's easier to go back onto the street in some ways than to stay clean. It's very difficult for a number of our women to see the light at the end of the tunnel. We continually, strive to provide that, but it's often very, very challenging. Again, men stay in the program longer, and we don't have any conclusive evidence as to why that is. They typically have housing to return to. And so based on those facts alone, we want to better understand what this number is about and how we can better implement solutions to keep the women in our programs, as well as provide them with the supports and the wraparound services when they are exiting our program. So if I take a look at some of the findings from the research, we have the presence of past trauma plays obviously a very relevant role in understanding the pathways for all offenders regardless of gender. So female offenders with the higher rates of physical and or sexual abuse history, and male offenders with the higher rates of emotional abuse as a child and higher rates of past physical abuse as a child. So how can our interventions best address those needs? Sorry, I'm just flipping for a quote. The distinct pathways to crime compared to men for women is pretty indicative of their unique experiences, such as residing in poverty, stricken neighborhoods, lifelong traumatic and abusive events, little social support, dysfunctional intimate relationships, and difficult managing and providing for their dependent children. They're all potential factors that cause women to commit crimes. And our job is to hold people responsible, and I believe the criminal justice system that's the role in our communities, to hold people responsible for the crimes that they've committed. The piece that sometimes is missing is the wraparound services to why did that person get into the criminal justice system, what perpetuated that pathway, and then how can we adapt some of the other services to help assist these individuals once they're back in the community. To be very specific, there is some stigma attached to mental health, and we hear about that a lot in the communities, on Twitter, on TV, and all the things that are helpful to destigmatize mental health and addictions. And there's another layer when somebody's in the criminal justice system, which really impacts their ability to access a lot of services depending on what they've done. Another finding from the research is the primary concern for women with trauma experiences is their challenge to abstain from substances. And I spoke a little bit about that. I think the window of opportunity is very small, and when we don't provide the intensive level of withdrawal support that's necessary, it's sometimes not successful. We are not trained to provide withdrawal management, and I'm speaking from a smaller community, but there's a lot of access issues to that type of supports, and especially based on the different substances. It's one of our major challenges is managing the substances, and when they're out in the community, managing individuals' access to those substances. Next slide is the experience of trauma is an important factor in defining women's experiences. In terms of the nature of offense, the types of issues that they face and the needs that they present with. We find that in our residents, poverty, housing, mental health, addictions, domestic violence, and PTSD are the top 6 factors affecting the women within our residents. As you see, it's basically the social determinants of health in many ways, and how they present to us typically is very, very challenged with the loss of children. They're all nearing, the vast majority is around the childbearing ages. So the separation from the children add another layer for women. I'm not saying that it's not there for men, but it's very prevalent for women as to how to manage that separation from their children. Also, the health care required for women is much different than the health care that's required for men. And how do we do the proper interventions and get them the proper supports when supports are very, very, and resources are very, very lean in many of the communities. I think that overall there's a limited research on the cumulative effects of trauma on victims' involvement in the justice system. In fact, that there is less known about the precise relationship between repetitive trauma exposure and offending behaviors with females. So although a lot of the research that I'm presenting isn't new information, some of the challenges is that there's not a lot of research, or not a bulk of research about women, and so we continue to try and figure out what the trauma effect is on the offending behavior and how to do the best work that we can in the community. The next slide indicates some of our other findings in that they have different presenting issues in the context of mental health, trauma, financial and legal needs, personal relationship, and substance abuse. In addition, the impact of childhood maltreatment and adulthood victimization is a crucial factor in considering the development of effective treatment programs for female offenders and for the planning of preventative strategies for future recidivism. When we're taking a look at this particular research, it really confirmed what we did know and will hopefully help us to be able to support some of the programs that we're seeing within the different communities. This is a quote from Alan Leashide, psychologist again. The pathways for women into the correctional system may or may not be a direct function of the presence of a mental health disorder, but the fact remains that the victimization mental health disorder will play an important role in women's responses to a correctional environment and the nature of programming that women require. If I take, for example, a particular female that I'm thinking of with great challenges, when we take a look at the personality disorders of women and how they fall along the continuum, and I know the DSM-4 has changed to the DSM-5 and it's a bit different than when I studied it, we take a look at females having more relational disorders in terms of dependency and borderline personality. Those interventions are much different than the interventions for someone with antisocial personality disorder. So again, I go back to the base fact that men are different than women. And most of the interventions or most of the understanding within the criminal justice system was built around men because they have just such a greater population, that it's really important that we understand how it is that we can address some of this. If we take a look at the intervention for borderline personality disorder, which is, one of the well-researched and evidence-based practices, DBT, dialectic behavioral theory, it's very labor-intensive. It's very, very lengthy in time in terms of the engagement with the individual. So how is it that we can use something like that in the correctional system? There's challenges to it. It's certainly brought through CSC, but when we take a look at the actual length that somebody's incarcerated, for women, it's a lot shorter. So even in our beds, the length of time a woman stays with us is a lot shorter than when a male offender stays with us. So knowing that in itself, it's hard to impact the women with certain theory and therapy if they're not with us and they're not staying in the house for lengthy periods of time. And then you put withdrawal on top of it when they're leaving before the end of the time that they are eligible to stay with us. Just compounds some of the challenges of programming. This is a quote from Howard Sapers. When we take a look at individuals that are in the criminal justice system, some of them won't even have access to the mental health care because they might be mild or moderate mentally ill. So that provides another challenge. And this quote is particularly focused on male offenders, so the regional treatment centers and some of the options for women are even less than. So when we're taking a look at how mental health presents within the provincial and the federal system as well as in the general community, how are we going to meet those needs? A lot of the traditional mental health care, CMHAs, et cetera, provide some support. We do in London have an adult therapeutic court which does sort of fill a lot of these mental health crisis beds, and that's a guilty plea court. So all of the women that go through that are, sentenced and are charged and are in the court system now, where their mental health issues may have impacted their ability to be a law-abiding citizen. So what happens sometimes is illnesses and behaviors are labeled in a disciplinary way as opposed to health issues. And I think that's a very, very serious concern, especially when we look at females that may have access to within their makeup or may have flavors or pieces of access to that are labeled perhaps difficult or I'm forgetting the word that I'm trying to come up with, that they're purposefully acting in this way to upset people. I believe that it does happen, but at the same time, we need to take a look at how the mental health is impacting their day-to-day functioning. And then again, boils right down to how we provide the proper interventions at the right time. So some recommendations, and through the research that we've presented, we've spoke to different ministries in terms of really understanding what resources are needed, treatment services that are really helpful to address the differing needs of men and women. We collect a lot of data on these individuals that's fed to the healthcare system, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. However, it's not necessarily sort of shared with Correctional Services of Canada or the provincial system, where some of those women have come from both of those institutions or on parole or probation. So having some increased community-based resources, working with our partners, and really marrying all of the different services in a really systemic, structured way would be helpful. Increase the understanding of the differences of trauma histories. So a lot of people have been trained, and our agency is fully trained in trauma-informed practices. but not all people are, and not all people understand what the impact of trauma is, and oftentimes there's a very large impact on the men as well as the women, and the interventions are very different for the different types of trauma. So having that increased understanding through the research can help us to address the trauma that's existing with men and with women. When we start to understand the nature of the offense and how that relates to the outcome of integration efforts, oftentimes when we're sitting at community tables and somebody has committed a crime against persons, there's a different response than a violent crime. And although there is an increase in violent crimes within the female sector, there still is a large portion that it's violence against people, or offenses against people. So how does that impact reintegration? What pieces can we put in place to prevent poverty if they've been stealing, those types of things? So it's really important, we feel, from the research to understand the nature of the offense so that we, again, can provide the appropriate support, and not with a broad brush, but as an individual way for each specific female that we work with in our house. The increased understanding of the use of gender-specific risk need tools when assessing women's risk and needs. Obviously, sentencing is based on risk, and how do we address that? There's a lot of work out at the University of Cincinnati around the tools that we can use that would better address the needs of women. I know I was in Cleveland at a presentation from the University of Cincinnati, and it was very, very helpful to understand how some questions can assist the LSRI to be able to address those specific gender needs that we could perhaps do better in understanding the risk. The shorter sentence is obviously indicative of the level of risk, but at the same time there is other things that we can do in the community to address those risk levels and perhaps address the needs of women better. In terms of the mental health and addiction piece, there's a real need, quite frankly, for trauma-focused therapy. So I'm a huge advocate for trauma-informed staff and employees. However, the actual trauma-focused therapy is really very, very well needed. I used to work at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, so I had access to a lot of different services within Toronto, and there's still within the general the traditional mental health and addiction population, there's a lot of people there that aren't able to access trauma-focused therapy, which is, again, very intensive, and you do need a lot of ego strength to be able to manage it. But at the same time, that's the underlying sort of risk issues that have led a lot of the women down the pathway of crime. So understanding how trauma-focused therapy can assist the criminal justice system would be very helpful. As a justice provider in London, we typically are not funded for a lot of clinical support. So when you do take a look at our CRFs, they're primarily staffed by individuals that have criminology degrees, some BAs in psychology, but the clinical piece is missing. And as we see from these slides and from this information, there's a significant need to address some of the very deep entrenched clinical issues that have followed the individuals along their pathways. So I'm a huge advocate for increasing that level of service. And then I do understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that we need to put some basic social supports in place first, but some access to some other supports, more sophisticated trauma-focused therapy, once those base needs are put in place, would really help, in my opinion, over the long trajectory of someone's life. Obviously, an increased understanding on the relationship and gender differences with respect to program completion and treatment success. Those pieces were very pivotal for me as I now sit on a committee in London for women at risk. We're working with some women that have completed program are successful in the community, have jobs, and have moved away from their life on the streets. Taking a look at some of this research and compiling it with what we're trying to do as a system in London has been really helpful to move some of those agenda items forward and to really understand how we can better support the women within our program to complete and move into a more pro-social life. And again, the research has allowed us to understand the correlation between the nature of the offense, why people are committing crime, and then the success of the program. In closing, one of my things that I like to do a lot is to just speak about some quotes. And so the one quote that I think that this research led us at St. Leonard's London to come to terms with is by Maya Angelou. And it says, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And I think that this research has allowed us to confirm what we know. And then now I think we need to do better, and we need to really look at the gender-responsive programming in the communities and how we can become evidence-based and provide services to women that effectively change their life and move them into a more pro-social manner. So, as you see, my references are up, and that's the end of my presentation. I am early and very, very happy to answer any questions that I can. If I'm not able to answer the questions, I certainly will welcome any emails and provide any support after the presentation as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. That's really amazing. So we do have quite a few questions throughout the presentation. The first one by Patricia was just asking if there's a copy of the slides available. Yes, they will be emailed out to all participants. Braden has a question, and that is, how is maltreatment defined?
So when we collect the intake, so our house in particular, we have a BSW, a social worker that assesses every individual for these beds. So she has a matrix on abuse and reviews that with each individual. I don't have that with me, but I can certainly forward that to you, Braden.
Okay, the next question was Emmanuel, and he asked, what are childhood disorders?
Can I just go back? In that we were talking about mental health?
I believe that was asked during the mental health issues slide that you had up.
So childhood disorders like oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, those types of diagnoses from the mental health system.
Okay, the next question was from Caroline, who asked, is there anyone looking into people who fall into the gray area of gender and crime, transgendered population, for example?
This particular work did not encompass that, and there's a lot of other special populations that we haven't looked at. Obviously, we have very, very limited funding for any type of research. In my particular agency, I believe we didn't do, the limitations to the research was looking at special populations like transgendered, Aboriginal, aged. Those aren't spoke to, and those aren't acknowledged in any of the research that we completed. I personally don't know of anybody. I'd be happy to look into that.
Thank you. The next question was from MCSCS, and it was actually just a comment that you may want to respond to. They said, I think another challenge women face is financial instability.
Poverty is one of the #1 issues that we face in the House, yes. I think they may have been referring to my first slide where I said the 3 things that we focus on in terms of the sex trade work, mental health and addictions. That might have been where that question came. And without a doubt, financial instability is one of the basic needs of, I can't pull the statistic off my head, but one of the most prevalent in our house.
Great. A question from Georgian College. They asked, are individuals who violate dispositions removed from the program, or do these persons remain in the program?
It's an individualized program, so depending on the courts, if they do breach a condition, then again, depending on the individual, how long they've been with us, what their level of success is, how they're motivated, we would keep someone in the program and advocate very strongly for them versus some of the alternatives to going back into EMDC. We feel strongly, obviously, on reintegration and doing the most we can in the community. At some point, our hands are tied, and we do have to rely on the justice system to make those decisions. But we work very closely with police, with Crown attorneys, defense attorneys, the judges and the JPs to provide the best service.
Okay, thank you. Roseanne from MCYS asked, she said, a cultural lens is also an important issue, i.e. Aboriginal First Nations. Is there a reflection of this in the research?
This particular research, that's one of the limitations, as I've mentioned, based on the fact that we just didn't have enough power or enough time, enough energy to look at all factors. We had to select the most, the ones for us that made the most sense in order to provide some of the direction with our programming. But without a doubt, that is a limitation of this research.
Great, thanks, Heather. And I just want to take a second to remind folks, too, before you do leave the webinar, if you could take a moment to fill out the survey. The link should be on the left of your screen, because your feedback is very helpful as we try to plan the future webinars. We do have a few more questions here. Lori asked, are there particular minority groups that face larger ratios between men and women? If so, which ones? And what are some of the causes of this?
I'm not exactly sure larger ratios between men and women, what that's pertaining to. Perhaps if she wants to email me or call, I could maybe address that. I'm not sure what she means. If she's on, she could type it.
Sure. Yeah, I think we can still take questions if Lori wants to add some more to that. Otherwise, perhaps she can get in contact with you one-on-one. We had another question from Deborah, who asked, can you speak to the unique needs and issues of racialized, queer, and trans women, and how this intersects with mental health, addictions, and criminalization?
That is a huge, huge area. I think that all of our special populations deserve a special lens and obviously research on how it does intersect. We didn't study that in this particular population and this particular sample set. But most of my research hasn't been around the special pops. It's been women in a general broad brush, just the differences between male and female. I haven't drilled down on the population within women itself. My feeling is there's A, not enough research on women, and then B, certainly not enough research on any of the special populations within the women portfolio. So right now I personally don't have any comment on that, but I certainly know that it is a huge need for the criminal justice population.
Thank you. Braden asked, are there risk or negative side effects to trauma-based therapy? Can it be too intense for some, and can it be re-traumatizing?
Absolutely, Braden. I couldn't agree more. Where I come in from trauma-based therapy is not necessarily when somebody's in a transition from the institution to us, but perhaps as the plan down the road, that if you look at the trajectory of the female, if you're able to put some social supports in place which assist the individual to a pro-social life, there are underlying issues as to why they were involved in crime, so it needs to be addressed. You can re-traumatize with the proper and appropriate trauma therapy professionals. That would be taken into consideration and managed. But yes, it's too intense for some, but there's also pieces of work that you could do to assist with some of the trauma to enable that person to deal with it in a way after if you take a look again at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it would be towards the mid to the higher parts after you put those base pieces, solid foundation into someone's life or assist them with that.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Elizabeth Fry Society. They asked, could it be that the mental health diagnoses are highly influenced by stereotypical gender responses to trauma?
I'm questioning whether this question is that the mental health diagnoses are wrong. I wouldn't be able to comment on that, having worked in the mental health field for 15 years and understanding what it takes to, A, get a diagnosis, and B, work with the healthcare system to provide some supports with that. I wouldn't be able to comment that they're influenced by gender responses to trauma, other than, in my belief, the DSM-4 has some specific criteria laid out for each. Whether we label it one thing or another in terms of a diagnosis, it's more about the interventions that I've always focused on in my work and in the work that we do at St. Leonard's.
Great, thank you, Heather. So the final question that we have was just from North Bay Regional Health Center, who asked if your email and address and contact information could be sent out. So hopefully that could be sent out with the presentation slides. I don't know if you'd like to also maybe enter it in on the Q&A board. That way it would come up for people so they can get in contact with you after.
I can if somebody tells me how to do it. I don't know how to do that, Mike, but I'm happy.
Heather, if you put it in the presenter chat box, we can send it to everyone.
Thanks.
So I'd just like to thank Heather again for presenting today. It was very, very interesting and generated lots of questions, so thank you very much. For those who participated, if you did have more than one person at your location participating, just please type in the Q&A box the number of people who took part so we can get an accurate reflection of that. And last time I'll remind you, take a minute and fill out the evaluation for us, please. And we do have, as I mentioned earlier, the two webinars coming up. May 25th, we have Bridging the Gap Between Mental Health and Criminal Justice Sectors by Addressing the Social Determinants of Health. And in June, with the date not yet determined, we will be looking at the Hamilton Rapid Response Teams. So thank you again, Heather, and thank you for everybody who took time to participate today.
Thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions as anyone wants. Please feel free.